Welcome to As the Veteran Vault, a place where real stories of courage, sacrifice, and survival are preserved and shared. If you believe in honoring voices that history should never forget, consider becoming a member of this channel. Today, I bring you a story not of glory, but of raw reality, one that will stay with you long after it's told. I still remember the moment everything changed. Not when the enemy fired, but when I realized I had forgotten one small switch. In war, it's never just the big decisions that matter. Sometimes it's the smallest mistake that follows you into chaos. What happened next wasn't just a battle. It was a test of instinct, fear, and survival. And it's something I've carried with me ever since. A friend of mine once explained the shift from being a loader in a tank to becoming the gunner. And it always stayed with me because I went through that same transition myself. When you're a loader, you have no idea what's happening outside. You're just doing your job, grabbing shells, loading them, feeding the machine gun belts, completely disconnected from the actual target. But the moment you move into the gunner's position, everything changes. Now you're looking through the sights, lining up the crosshairs, and for the first time you understand exactly what you're about to do. The first time you pull that trigger in a Sherman tank, you know it's going to take someone's life. That realization hits hard. It's not something that comes easy. But after a while, after being fired upon and after losing a tank, your mindset shifts. It becomes something entirely different. I still remember the day everything changed. I had gone to a movie with my best friend, just a normal day like any other. When we got back, his father, who was a doctor, had a serious look on his face. We could tell something was wrong. Then he told us that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Right then, we knew the country was going to war. At that time, we were still in high school. Once we graduated, we all went straight to work while waiting to be drafted. Months went by, and none of my friends had been called yet. By January, I figured they'd be next, so I decided to get ahead of it and volunteered myself. I went to the draft board and signed up to go with the next group. Funny thing is, I ended up going before any of them did. When I officially entered the military, I got orders to report to the train station in Wheeling, West Virginia. From there, we were sent to Fort Hays in Columbus. The first night, we were still in our civilian clothes. The next day, everything changed. They handed us a box, had us write our home address on it, and told us to pack up all our personal belongings. Those boxes were shipped off, and just like that, we were standing there with nothing. Then came the process. Medical exams, shots, uniforms, boots, everything that turned us from civilians into soldiers in a matter of hours. Before I enlisted, I had been driving a truck for Royal Crown. My father gave me some advice. Don't tell them you're a truck driver. He thought maybe if I said I was a student, they might send me somewhere for schooling instead of putting me behind a wheel. So when the time came, I told them I didn't want anything to do with driving. The officer looked at my record, saw I had experience, and still handed me my assignment. When I arrived and asked what kind of unit it was, the answer came back, tanks. I remember thinking, great. To this day, I believe that officer got a good laugh out of it. He didn't give me a steering wheel, but he gave me something close. Those tanks ran on levers instead. I was assigned to Headquarters Company, 2nd Battalion, 81st Armored Regiment of the 8th Armored Division. Inside a Sherman tank, space was tight, really tight. There were 5 of us in total. Up front in the hull, you had the driver on the left and the bow gunner on the right, who also helped with other tasks. In the turret, the loader stood on the left, the gunner on the right, and behind the gunner was the tank commander, who kept watch and gave orders. Living inside that tank wasn't easy, especially during combat. At night, you couldn't just step out whenever you wanted. We made do with what we had, rolling up blankets against the metal, leaning into them, trying to get some kind of rest. We were young, so we managed. But there wasn't much room to move, let alone get comfortable. Getting in and out of the tank wasn't simple either. There were hatches for the driver and bow gunner, and one main hatch on top for the turret crew. If something happened and you needed to get out fast, the tank commander would go first, followed by the gunner. The loader had to squeeze under the recoil guard of the cannon to get out next. There was also an emergency escape hatch underneath the bow gunner's position, but it wasn't always reliable. I remember one time we tried to use it after digging out a small resting spot beneath the tank. The hatch had rusted shut. We had to find a hammer and force it open. That was the reality. Equipment didn't always work the way it was supposed to. The tank carried different types of ammunition, armor-piercing rounds, high-explosive shells, and occasionally smoke rounds. We also had plenty of .30 caliber machine gun ammo. The bow gunner didn't get much chance to fire, though. His gun was positioned low, while his viewing scope was much higher, which made aiming difficult. Most of the time, he was busy passing ammunition up to the loader during combat. I crossed over overseas on D-Day, traveling on the Queen Elizabeth. We landed in Scotland, then moved down into England, where I spent a few weeks before heading to France. By the time I reached the front lines, it had been about a month since D-Day. I was assigned as a loader in a tank crew that had already seen combat. They had been through things they never talked about. I didn't ask and they didn't offer. That's just how it was. I stepped into my role, did my job, and became part of the crew, carrying on without ever fully knowing what had happened before I got there. After moving out from that position, we had a few brief encounters, nothing too intense at first. Then one night we drove for hours, pushing through the darkness. By morning, alongside units like the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One and others, we had surrounded Mons in Belgium. We managed to capture a large number of German soldiers there. After Mons, we continued toward the Ardennes and then moved in the direction of the Siegfried Line. At that stage, the resistance we faced wasn't too heavy, at least not in the areas my group was operating in. We had managed to get behind the German forces, which was exactly what the army wanted. The idea was to leave those trapped units for the French resistance to handle while we rushed ahead. If we could reach the Siegfried Line before they regrouped, they wouldn't be able to defend their own territory effectively. The first time I came face to face with a German soldier, it wasn't what I expected. He was just a kid, maybe 14 or 15 years old, only a little younger than me. He was sitting on the front of a jeep as a prisoner, holding onto a crucifix, shaking uncontrollably. He looked absolutely terrified. I remember wanting to tell him he'd be okay, that we weren't going to harm him, that he'd be fed and taken care of. But I didn't know a single word of German, so I couldn't say anything. Later, once we were fully engaged in combat, my feelings changed. They had years of experience in war, while we were still learning in many ways. At that point, I saw them as the enemy, and I focused on doing my part. When I moved from being a loader to becoming a gunner, everything shifted again. As a loader, you're just working, feeding shells, loading rounds, without really knowing what's happening outside. But as a gunner, you're looking directly at the target through the sights. The first time you fire, you're fully aware of what it means. It's not something that feels natural or easy. But after going through it, especially after being fired upon and losing a tank, your mindset hardens. It becomes survival. The first time I was wounded came when our tank was hit. The shell struck right at the level where the gunner and the tank commander were positioned. It tore straight through both of them, killing them instantly. Their bodies collapsed right where they stood, blocking the only exit I had from the turret. I was trapped. I tried to move them, but I couldn't. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw light coming from below. The driver had already gotten out. So I dropped down into the hull and climbed out that way, diving off the tank as soon as I could. Once I hit the ground, I started running. When a tank gets hit, you're suddenly out in the open with no helmet, no weapon, completely exposed on the front line. Standing still isn't an option. As I ran, the driver and the bow gunner shouted from a nearby embankment, asking about the lieutenant and the other crew member. I just shook my head and kept moving. Then I tripped over something, maybe a root, and went down hard. My shoulder popped out of place. I managed to force it back in, but that's when I realized my leg was bleeding. I spotted a light tank nearby and ran toward it, asking for a bandage. One of the crew told me to come up and get it, so I climbed onto the tank. Just as I reached up, a German soldier opened fire on me with a submachine gun. I reacted quickly, turned, and pointed him out to the tank commander. He swung the gun around and took him out immediately. After that, I wrapped my leg and looked for some cover. I found a partially dug foxhole and ran toward it. Not long after, a medic came by and asked if I could walk. I told him I could. He directed me to move through a gap in the line where a half-track was waiting. I made my way there and climbed in. There were a few of us sitting together, along with a badly wounded infantryman. They took us back to a field hospital where they treated my leg and gave me a shot, the kind that makes your arm hurt more than the original wound. I spent the night in a tent on a cot. Then the next day I made my way back to the company command post. When I got there, the first sergeant looked surprised to see me. He asked what had happened, and I told him the tank had been hit and we'd lost men. He told me to rest, so I lay down in the grass. It was mid-September, warm enough to relax for a bit, but that didn't last long. The first sergeant came back and said they had a chance to get another tank. He told me I'd go back, take command, and bring it up. I agreed. I went down with a jeep, picked up the tank, and rode back as the acting tank commander. When I returned, the first sergeant met me again and said he hated to do it, but they needed gunners more than anything. So just like that, I was reassigned. We pulled together the remaining crew, the driver, the bow gunner, and another man who had survived. And within 24 hours of losing our tank, we were back on the front line again. Later, during the Battle of the Bulge, things got much more intense. We were up against Colonel Piper's SS troops, and word came down that they weren't taking prisoners. They didn't have the resources to deal with them, so they simply didn't keep any alive. Once we heard that, the fight became even more serious. It was no longer just about orders, it was about survival. It was them or us. At one point, our unit was moving to relieve another group when we came upon a German column at a T intersection. Our lead tank commander ordered a high-explosive round loaded and told the driver to push forward at full speed. As we came around the corner, we saw the last vehicle in their line, a truck towing an anti-tank gun, one of their powerful 88s. The enemy crew didn't have time to react. Before they could set up, our lead tank fired, destroying the gun and the crew. Another round hit the truck, setting off an explosion that lit everything up like fireworks. We had to stop and wait for the flames to die down. After about half an hour or more, the order came to move again. The first tank carefully maneuvered around the wreckage, dipping into a ditch and climbing back up. Inside the tank, we had two ways to rotate the turret, either manually, which was fairly quick, or using the powered system, which allowed smoother control with just the flip of a switch. In moments like that, every second and every movement mattered, and you relied completely on your training and the men around you to keep going. At that point, the equipment was finally working again, though it was a bit slower than before. As we moved down the road, I had the electrical system switched on, but when we stopped and had to wait, it got really loud, so loud that I decided to shut it off. Later, when we started moving again and went down into a ditch to get around a truck, I completely forgot I had turned it off. The gun was loose, and as we moved, it swung around and got jammed into the bank. We had to back up, get back onto the road, and then climb out to check if any dirt had gotten into the barrel. Once we made sure everything was clear, we got moving again to catch up with the German column, and more importantly, to catch up with our other 4 tanks. When we reached the village, those 4 tanks had already passed under a railroad underpass. On the other side, the Germans had time to prepare. They were experienced fighters, hardened from years of war. When they saw those tanks, they must have figured that was the entire group, and they picked them off one by one. Lieutenant Hope was killed that day, his very first day in combat. That was a tough thing to take in. Our tank stopped before going under the underpass. Instead, we joined up with another group, 5 tanks that came along behind. We merged into their platoon, and from there the plan shifted. We were going to head south and link up with General Patton's forces coming from the opposite direction to close the gap. From that point on, we moved from village to village, taking a new one each day. On my last day in combat, we rolled into a place, I think it was called Frère or something like that. A French or Belgian name, I'm not sure. My tank was the 5th one in line again. We came out of the woods, crossed a field, and moved toward the town. The tank commander was on the radio, listening to reports from the lead tank already inside the village. He ordered me to fire a shell into the upper floor of a house. I did. Then he told the driver to pull us right up alongside the building, near a window. He tossed a grenade into the 2nd story, which flushed a German soldier out the front. We shot him as he came out. We moved away from the house, crossed the road, went over a low stone fence and into another field. At that point, the infantry nearby started taking small arms fire from another building. The commander told me to swing the gun in that direction. As I did, a German soldier suddenly stood up with a Panzerfaust and fired. He missed the tank, but there were infantrymen nearby, and several of them were hit by fragments. One guy had a chunk torn out of his nose and was bleeding badly. The commander shouted for me to adjust the gun. I swung it around, looking through the periscope, trying to line up the shot. I could see the enemy soldier, but I couldn't quite get the sights on him. Before I could fire, he shot again. This time, the round hit. I was leaning forward at the time, focused on aiming. The impact came just behind my head. The force slammed backward, and it killed the tank commander instantly. His fist hit my back before he collapsed down into the tank. Even now, I can still hear the infantry outside yelling, "There he is! There he is!" but none of them fired at him. I understood why. It's not easy to pull the trigger knowing you're about to take someone's life. Every one of them had a loaded weapon, but no one shot. With the commander gone, the driver was already out, and the loader had climbed out too. I followed, and the loader came right behind me. We jumped down from the tank while still under some scattered small arms fire from houses down the road. I yelled at the infantry to get inside the nearest house, and we ran for cover. Once inside, I shouted again, telling them to stay away from the windows. I've laughed about that ever since. Here I was, just a corporal, and that was probably the only time I ever really threw my rank around, yelling orders like that. We started tending to each other's wounds. After a while, I noticed my head felt cold. I reached up and saw blood on my hand. I asked one of the guys what it looked like. He said it didn't seem too bad, but it was definitely bleeding. I figured I should get to the medics. One of the guys there had a badly wounded leg. We had already bandaged him as best we could, but he couldn't walk. We had a field to cross to reach safety, so I told him to climb onto my back. I carried him across to the road, where we'd be less exposed. As we stood there, a jeep came along carrying a major who had been shot. They stopped and picked us up, then drove us to an aid station. The jeep left, and we went inside. The wounded soldier sat in a chair while I sat on the floor next to him. It was a triage point, where a doctor quickly assessed who could be saved and who needed immediate care. Then the door opened, and an ambulance driver asked if there was room for one more. The doctor looked over at me and told me to go. I protested, saying the other guy was bleeding worse, but the doctor insisted, so I went. The ambulance took me to a field hospital. They sat me down and started pulling pieces of metal out of my head, dropping them into a metal tray. I asked if I could keep one, and the doctor said yes. I put it in my pocket. After they finished cleaning and treating the wound, they told me to lie down on a cot in another room and rest. There were a few other guys there too, wounded but still able to move. We figured we'd finally get a break, a chance to stretch out somewhere warm and safe. That didn't last long. A sergeant came in and told us to get back into a truck. We all complained. We were wounded, but it didn't matter. We climbed in and he took us back to our units. I stayed with my company that night. The next night, I was up the whole time with severe diarrhea. By morning, the first sergeant came over and told me he was promoting me to tank commander. I told him I didn't want the job. I'd already served under 5 tank commanders, and I preferred being the gunner. Eventually, he agreed. He then told me breakfast was ready, but when I tried to sit up, I passed out. I was badly dehydrated. When I came to and tried to stand, my legs were shaky. The medics were called, and they took me across the street to a house. Inside was an elderly Belgian woman who took care of me. She brought up a warm brick from the stove and placed it by my feet. It was freezing outside, deep snow everywhere, and that warmth felt incredible. I could have stayed there forever. Eventually, an ambulance came and took me back to Liège. From there, someone decided I'd had enough. They sent me on to Paris, then back to the coast, onto a ship, and eventually back to England. I spent the rest of my time there with the 95th Bomb Group. When I think about my service, I don't really see it in terms of pride. I've never looked at it that way. But I suppose, if anything, I can say I did what I was asked to do. As a tank gunner, I carried out my responsibilities the way I was supposed to. And maybe that, in itself, is something to be proud of. When I look back on everything that happened, I don't see it as a story of heroism or anything larger than life. What stays with me are the moments, the small decisions, the fear, the confusion, and the people. I remember the noise of the engine, the weight of responsibility sitting in that tank, and the split seconds where everything could change forever. I remember the men we lost, like Lieutenant Hope on his very first day, and the tank commander beside me who never got a second chance. Those aren't things you forget. They stay with you long after the war is over, long after the uniforms are put away. War has a way of stripping everything down to its most basic level. It's not about glory, and it's not about pride the way people sometimes imagine. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared, even when you don't feel ready, and even when you don't fully understand why things are unfolding the way they are. It's about relying on the people next to you and hoping they can rely on you just the same. In those moments, rank doesn't matter as much as instinct, and survival depends on trust, quick thinking, and sometimes just plain luck. I think about that day when everything went wrong. The hit that took our commander, the confusion that followed, the sound of voices yelling, and the realization that it was now up to us to keep going. There was no time to stop and process it. You just move, react, and try to keep yourself and the people around you alive. And even in the middle of all that chaos, there were moments of humanity. Helping a wounded soldier, sharing what little strength you had, or even just telling someone to get away from a window because you didn't want to see them get hurt. When it was all over for me, it didn't end with some grand moment. It ended quietly, being pulled out, treated, sent from one place to another, until eventually I was out of it altogether. And in a way, that's how most of it felt. Not like a clean ending, but more like something that just slowly faded while the memories stayed sharp. If there's anything I take from it now, it's not pride in what I did, but acceptance. I was there, I did my job, and I made it through when others didn't. That's something I carry with a sense of responsibility more than anything else. Because every story like mine is also a story of the people who didn't get to come back and tell theirs. So when I think about my time in service, I don't think about medals or recognition. I think about duty. I think about standing where I was needed and doing what I was trained to do, even when it was hard. And maybe that's the simplest way to put it. I did what was asked of me, alongside men who did the same, and together we got through something that none of us would ever forget.